Imagine you've done everything right. You read the books, understood the concepts. You're not the person who needs a lecture on compound interest. And yet, the results don't quite match the knowledge. That gap isn't an intelligence problem. It's not a discipline problem either. It's something most smart people never think to examine because it's too close to see. By the end of this, you'll have a name for it. And once you do, you'll start noticing it everywhere. Don't skip ahead, but in the third part, I tie everything together, and that's exactly where it all clicks. There's a strange assumption underneath most personal finance conversations. Once you notice it, you start hearing it everywhere. The assumption goes like this: if people simply knew more, they would behave better. If they understood compound interest, they would save. If they understood debt, they would stop overspending. If they understood investing, they would start building wealth. At first glance, that all sounds reasonable. Education matters, information matters, and skills matter. But then you look around. There are people who understand nutrition and still eat terribly. People who understand the value of exercise and never move their bodies. People who understand relationships and still wreck them. And there are plenty of people who understand personal finance while making decisions that damage their future month after month. So knowledge alone isn't the deciding factor, which raises an important question. What actually determines behavior? What determines whether someone consistently moves toward a better future or trades it away for temporary comfort? Pay attention long enough and something subtle comes into focus. People rarely act according to what they know. They act according to what feels important in the moment. That's a critical difference. A person may fully understand that saving for retirement matters. They may agree with it intellectually. But when the moment arrives, standing in a store looking at something expensive, the emotional weight shifts. Suddenly, the future feels abstract. The purchase feels real. The pleasure feels close at hand. The future version of themselves becomes psychologically distant, almost imaginary. So they spend, not because they are rational and not because they're immoral or incapable of discipline, but because in that moment, they evaluated immediate comfort as more valuable than long-term stability. That's a hidden mechanism, momentary lapse in judgment because of evaluation, not intention and not intelligence. Evaluation, the weight we assign to competing choices. Once you see this clearly, an enormous amount of human behavior starts making sense, including financial behavior. Keep watching and I'll show you later in this video how to shift that. Most people think wealth gets built through dramatic moments, big investments, big risks, and big breakthroughs. But financial life is usually shaped through thousands of small evaluations repeated over many years. Do I buy this or save the money? Do I purchase this or let it pass? Do I learn this skill or put it off again? Do I spend my evenings consuming content or building something, even though that might not lead me anywhere? Ordinary moments, small decisions, repeated endlessly. We all struggle with those choices, and those moments aren't random. They emerge from the model of reality a person carries around in their head, their worldview. When people hear the word worldview, they sometimes picture philosophy professors arguing about abstract ideas. But a worldview is much simpler than that. It's the internal map that you use to interpret reality. It determines what you notice, what you ignore, what you believe is possible, what you believe is realistic, what you believe is worth pursuing, and most importantly, what feels emotionally true. Imagine two people walking through the exact same world. One believes opportunity is abundant, and the other believes it's scarce. Those two people are not living in the same psychological reality. The first one notices possibilities constantly, unmet needs, gaps in markets, problems worth solving, skills worth learning, people worth knowing. Even setbacks are interpreted differently. Failure becomes feedback. Rejection becomes a redirection. Difficulty feels temporary in the moment. Now consider someone who fundamentally believes wealth is reserved for other people, that success requires connections, luck, or resources they simply don't have right now. They may encounter the same identical opportunities and simply dismiss them before seriously considering them. Not because they choose to fail, but because their worldview filters what appears meaningful and important to them. This is important. People don't act based on reality. They act based on their interpretation of reality. And those interpretations reinforce themselves over time. Someone who believes money is scarce often stops looking for ways to create value. They stop experimenting, they stop paying attention, and they stop imagining. Eventually, you hear them say things like, "There are no opportunities here." Meanwhile, someone else in the same environment keeps noticing opportunities everywhere. Not because the universe favors them, but because they train themselves to see differently. It's a skill and it can be learned and improved. Here's what's interesting. Both people genuinely feel each one is correct. If you ask them, they will come up with many reasons why what they believe is correct way of thinking. That's how powerful worldview is. It becomes invisible to the person in it. It's like the fish doesn't know it's wet. This doesn't mean optimism alone creates wealth. Reality still matters. Skills matter, timing matters, effort matters enormously. But worldview determines whether those things get pursued consistently in the first place. Because before behavior comes perception, and before perception can happen comes belief. If you don't believe something is possible even, you would never spend the energy to pursue that. That's just a normal thing to do. This is why two people can receive identical financial advice and produce entirely different results. One hears invest consistently for the long term and thinks that makes sense. Future stability matters. The other hears the same sentence and mutters under their breath, "What's the point? The economy will collapse anyway." Or, "I'll never have enough for that to matter." Or, "I deserve to enjoy my life now." I've heard so many people say, "I'm just not a saver," as if it's a genetic trait. Same information, different internal evaluations, completely different future. And this explains something that confuses a lot of people. Why good habits feel effortless for some people and completely exhausting for others. Because habits aren't powered primarily by discipline. They're powered by alignment. When values align with actions, behavior gets easier, cleaner, more automatic. A person who genuinely values physical fitness, for example, doesn't experience every workout as a moral battle. A person who genuinely values financial stability doesn't experience every avoided purchase as deprivation. They're not constantly resisting themselves. Their interpretation of the behavior is different. The behavior feels congruent with who they are. Someone whose deeper priorities are comfort, stimulation, status, or emotional escape will feel enormous friction trying to maintain long-term discipline. Not because they are weak, but because their internal value hierarchy is pointing somewhere else. This is exactly the moment where most financial conversations go sideways. But not this one. They focus almost entirely on the specific tactics. Spreadsheets and budgets, investment account types, interest rates, and cutting expenses. Those things matter, sure, but tactics sitting on top of unstable worldview rarely survive the everyday stresses that are inevitable. The moment life becomes emotionally difficult, people revert to whatever they truly value underneath the surface. This is why people often know exactly what they should do while repeatedly failing to do it. Not because they lack information, but because another value keeps winning the emotional bidding war. Comfort, relief, impulse, status, distraction, and convenience. If that underlying evaluation system never changes, the person ends up trapped in a lifelong cycle of self-negotiation, trying to outsmart themselves forever, trying to force behaviors that never became internally meaningful to them, which is exhausting and, strangely, very fragile. Because willpower is real, but it's finite. It's unreliable when it has to carry the full weight of your life, especially when you're tired, when you're stressed, when something in your life goes wrong. The people who succeed long term usually aren't the ones endlessly fighting with themselves. They are the ones who gradually changed what felt valuable. Gradually. And once that shift happens and takes place, behavior changes naturally. Not perfectly, not instantly, but naturally. Here's what I want you to hold on to as we go into the next section. Discipline isn't the problem. It never was. What's actually driving your decisions is something most people spend their entire lives never looking at directly. Keep watching as we unpack this more. There's a sentence people repeat constantly in modern culture. Just have more discipline. In small doses, that advice is useful. Of course, discipline matters. Of course, there are moments where you have to override your impulse. But discipline somehow became the explanation for almost everything. Financially unstable? Lack of discipline. Overspending? Lack of discipline. Procrastinating? Lack of discipline. Never investing? Lack of discipline. And yet, if discipline were truly the primary answer, something strange would follow. The most disciplined people would automatically become the most financially successful. But that's not at all what we see. We know people who are extraordinarily hardworking and remain stuck financially for decades. People who maintain intense discipline in one area of life while completely failing apart in the other. And people who appear remarkably consistent without relying on heroic willpower at all. It seems that they're doing it effortlessly. Why? Because discipline is downstream from identity and evaluation. A person can force themselves to act against their deeper priorities for a while. Everyone can. But eventually, the emotional system pushes back. Fatigue arrives. Resentment arrives. And eventually, people return to what feels meaningful to them. This is why someone can stay committed to fitness for 15 years, while another person can't imagine 15 days. The difference isn't restraint. One person sees exercise as part of who they are. The other sees it as a punishment for eating donuts. The same thing plays out financially. One person experiences saving money as a security, freedom, and future expansion. Another experiences saving money as a loss, restriction, and deprivation. Think about the implications of that. If saving feels emotionally painful, then every financially responsible action requires resistance. Every decision becomes a small internal conflict, and humans aren't built to sustain constant internal conflict indefinitely. We eventually move toward psychological ease. So the real point of leverage isn't force, it's evaluation. What does this choice mean to you? What emotional weight does it carry? Because people naturally move toward what feels valuable and away from what feels costly. Whether we're talking about money, relationship, health, or almost anything else. Advertisers understand this extremely well. Modern marketing rarely tries to convince you logically. It tries to alter emotional evaluation. A luxury car isn't presented as transportation. It's presented as an identity, status, importance, freedom. The product becomes emotionally fused with meaning. And once that happens, people stop evaluating purchases rationally. They evaluate them psychologically. Will this make me feel successful, admired, less anxious? Will it temporarily remove discomfort? This is exactly why people sometimes buy things that they can't afford while simultaneously telling themselves they're trying to become financially stable. The two competing value systems are in different dimensions and running at once. Usually, the emotionally immediate one will win. Here's the part many people miss. Most assume this process is happening consciously. It usually isn't. Much of human behavior is automatic pattern recognition, shaped through years of repetition, emotion, observation, and cultural conditioning. People often absorb beliefs about money long before they ever earn serious money for themselves. From parents, from friends, from culture, from social class, from television, from the emotional atmosphere surrounding wealth in their environment. Some people grow up hearing money creates freedom. Others hear rich people are greedy. Some hear you have to work endlessly to survive. Others hear there are opportunities everywhere if you make yourself useful. These ideas get integrated in subconscious, and later people call them reality. But most often they're just inherited interpretations. And inherited interpretations shape behavior more than many people realize. Someone who unconsciously associates wealth with guilt may sabotage financial progress repeatedly. Not intentionally, but psychologically, because every increase in income creates internal discomfort. Success starts conflicting with identity. If you ask them why in retrospect they seemed like that was a good idea to do, they often can't even answer that question. Meanwhile, someone who associates wealth with contribution and independence finds that earning more feels emotionally better and more comfortable. Expansion feels safe. Same world, different evaluations, and different outcomes. Take a second with that, because if any of those inherited beliefs sound familiar, if something in there landed a little too close to home, that recognition is exactly where they will get useful for you. And this leads to something that rarely is discussed honestly. Many financial problems aren't math problems. They're perception problems. A person may know how to budget, understand retirement accounts, understand that debt is bad, but if their internal evaluation system still prioritizes immediate emotional relief over long-term positioning, knowledge changes very little. It's similar to understanding nutrition while emotionally depending on food for comfort. Yes, the information is present, but evaluation dominates behavior. This is exactly why people sometimes feel trapped in patterns they intellectually reject. They assume mistakenly that they're broken somehow, lazy or weak. But often what's actually happening is simpler. Their actions still make emotional sense according to the worldview that they currently carry. That's an important distinction. If behavior is driven by evaluation, then sustainable change doesn't begin with self-condemnation. It begins with honesty. You have to become honest about what you actually value, not what sounds respectable, not what you claim to value intellectually. What you repeatedly sacrifice for reveals what truly sits at the top of the hierarchy for you. You don't need to imagine it, you can just look around. But this can be uncomfortable to face. Many people say they value freedom while structuring their everyday lives entirely around comfort. They say they value stability while constantly prioritizing entertainment. They say they want financial independence while spending every surplus dollar eliminating temporary boredom. This isn't a moral accusation. Everybody does some version of this as well, as do I. Human beings naturally drift towards short-term emotional reward. The problem isn't enjoying pleasure. The problem is we're doing it unconsciously, because unconscious priorities build unconscious futures. Years later, people look around confused by the results they slowly created through thousands of small repeated evaluations. That's why often people can't tell how they got there. It's just too many decisions, most of them they no longer even remember making. Clarity reorganizes emotional weights. Once you deeply understand what matters to you, many decisions become surprisingly easy. Not because temptation disappears, but because comparison becomes clear. Imagine two people looking at the exact same purchase. One sees excitement and the other sees delayed freedom. One sees pleasure and the other sees 20 additional hours trapped at work they don't even like. One sees luxury and the other sees a future investment quietly shrinking. Same object, different meanings, different emotional consequences. And the meaning drives behavior a lot more than raw logic. Which brings us to the central shift. Most people try to change behavior directly, but lasting transformation runs in the reverse order. First, worldview changes, then evaluation changes, then behavior changes automatically. That order matters enormously. When people skip the worldview entirely, they end up relying on constant self-control and willpower. And while self-control is valuable, it is expensive, mentally, emotionally. Eventually, people get tired, and tired people revert to default patterns. When evaluation changes deeply enough, discipline gets dramatically easier. A person who genuinely values long-term financial independence doesn't need to argue with themselves every time they skip an unnecessary expense. The decision is easy. It starts feeling obvious, almost a relaxing thing. This is the part many people often misunderstand when they hear conversations about mindset. They assume it's some woo-woo thing. They assume it's about positive thinking and blind optimism, pretending reality is easy when it's not. It isn't. A useful worldview isn't a fantasy. It is an orientation that makes effective action possible. Believing skills can be learned creates different behavior than believing talent is fixed. Believing opportunities can be created or found produces different behavior than believing they only appear through sheer luck. Believing small, consistent investments matter produces different behavior than believing only massive wealth creates security. Over decades, those small behavioral differences compound enormously, until two people who started in a similar place end up living radically different lives. Not because one was universally smarter, but because one carried a worldview that kept generating better evaluations. Better valuations, better repeated decisions. Even a tiny bit more makes a huge difference over time. That's how lives change. Not through one dramatic breakthrough, but through thousands of emotionally aligned choices, repeated consistently over time. So now you understand what's actually driving the gap. The question is, what do you do about it? That's part 3, and it's more practical than you might expect. This is the part that makes it applicable to your life and is worth watching until the end. So the obvious question becomes, how do you actually change your evaluation system? How do you reshape the worldview that determines what feels important? This is exactly the spot people tend to get skeptical. They hear mindset and immediately picture affirmations, motivational slogans, or a kind of relentless manufactured positivity. But changing evaluation is more practical than that. In fact, it's actually less dramatic than people expect. You are not trying to hypnotize yourself into a different person overnight. You're trying to become more consciously aligned, building a model of reality that consistently points your behavior toward outcomes you genuinely want. And the process is not effortless, but simple. It is much simpler than many people think. It begins with one uncomfortable realization. Your current behavior already makes sense according to your current priorities. That sentence matters. Until people understand it, they stay trapped in self-conflict, assuming they're failing because they're weak. But weakness is often a misleading explanation. If someone repeatedly spends impulsively, avoids investing, and ignores long-term planning, and prioritizes immediate pleasure, there's usually a deeper value structure operating underneath. The short-term reward genuinely feels more valuable to them in the moment. And unless that changes, tactics alone rarely stick. So the first step is honesty. Calm, brutal honesty. Look at your life and ask, what am I repeatedly optimizing for? Not what you claim to value. What do your patterns actually reveal? Patterns are always honest. There is no embarrassment here. You don't have to tell your realization to anybody. A person who says they value health, but consistently sacrifices sleep, movement, and nutrition for stimulation is optimizing for something else. A person who says they value financial stability, but continually expands their lifestyle is optimizing for something else. This isn't about shame. Shame usually makes people less effective, not more. This is all just about accurate observation. You can't recognize priorities you refuse to examine. Once people get honest about their existing evaluations, something interesting happens. They begin noticing the hidden emotional rewards driving their behavior. Overspending, for instance, often isn't about the object itself. It may be about relief or identity or escape or social belonging or temporary emotional elevation. Maybe for you status is everything, and that's a version of status signaling. When people finally see the emotional transaction clearly, the behavior loses some of its unconscious pull. They're no longer just buying a product, they're watching themselves purchase a feeling. Maybe it's happiness, maybe it's relief. That awareness matters enormously. Unconscious behavior thrives in vagueness. Clarity weakens compulsion. This leads directly into the second shift. You have to make your future emotionally real. One of the biggest reasons people undermine long-term goals is because the future feels abstract while the present feels vivid. The brain naturally prioritizes immediate emotional experience. If your future exists only as a blurry concept, it will consistently lose against present comfort. That's a losing battle. This is why people save mechanically for a few weeks and then stop. The emotional connection was never built deeply enough. The future remained theoretical. People who sustain good financial habits over decades often do something differently. They develop emotional intimacy with the future they're building. Freedom becomes vivid. Security becomes vivid. The ability to walk away from unhealthy work or work they dislike becomes vivid. The ability to help family or friends becomes vivid. The reduction of anxiety becomes vivid. Imagine never having to worry about ever being laid off. And once the future becomes emotionally tangible, short-term sacrifice stops feeling like punishment. It begins feeling like improvement. That's a profound psychological shift. Saving money is no longer subtraction. It becomes construction. You're building optionality, flexibility, free time, and peace of mind. People endure difficulty far more easily when the difficulty feels meaningful. This is why two people can experience the exact same financial constraint very differently. One feels deprived and the other feels strategically positioned. Same action, different interpretations. different emotional experiences. And the third shift is equally important. Reduce unnecessary decision fatigue. One reason financially responsible behavior feels difficult for many people is that they negotiate every single decision many times over repeatedly. Every purchase becomes a multi-hour internal debate. Every saving choice requires fresh motivation. Every investment contribution feels optional in the moment. This creates enormous mental friction. The solution isn't stronger daily discipline. It's reducing the number of daily negotiations you must undertake. Whenever possible, decide just once. Automate savings, automate investments, create structural defaults that align with your long-term priorities. It's hard, it's painful, but you only have to suffer once. Structure is often more reliable than motivation. People dramatically underestimate the power of environment and systems, assuming behavior is purely character-driven. But behavior is heavily shifted by friction and shaped by the environment. If beneficial behavior is difficult and destructive behavior is easy, most people drift toward the easier option over time. We all do it, myself included. Not because they're defective, but because we're human. Intelligent personal finance is often less about becoming extremely disciplined and more about becoming intelligently arranged. Reduce impulsive exposure, remove unnecessary temptations, and simplify your good decisions. Increase friction around destructive ones, and suddenly life requires less internal combat. Many people secretly believe adulthood is supposed to feel like endless self-denial. But sustainable financial behavior usually feels surprisingly calm, not dramatic, not heroic, calm, because the person is no longer fighting two competing identities constantly. Values and actions have become more aligned. This brings up another truth worth naming. Many people postpone financial responsibility because they unconsciously associate it with the end of enjoyment, as though becoming financially stable means becoming emotionally lifeless. That's a false narrative. Mature financial thinking isn't anti-enjoyment, it's anti-fragility. The goal isn't to remove all pleasure from life. It's to stop sacrificing long-term stability for short-term emotional impulses that are often forgotten days or even hours later. Ironically, people who manage money well usually experience more enjoyment over time, not less. Because anxiety decreases, freedom increases, choices expand, and pressure is eliminated entirely. There is never buyer's remorse. They're not constantly living at the edge of instability, which means their enjoyment becomes less desperate, less compulsive, more relaxed, and they stop experiencing every unexpected expense as a personal crisis. That emotional stability changes the texture of everyday life way more than many people realize until they get there. Now, there are essentially two paths. The first is attempting to overpower yourself indefinitely. Constant resistance, constant negotiation, constant willpower, trying to outrun your impulse forever. That may be for some people, but that is not for you. Some people sustain this for periods of time, but it's exhausting because eventually the person feels internally divided. One side chasing the future, the other constantly demanding immediate relief. The second path is slower initially, but far more sustainable. You reorganize what feels valuable, you clarify what actually matters to you. You consciously, over time, reshape the worldview generating your decisions. And then behavior begins changing with far less friction and effort. Not perfectly, you'll still make mistakes, everyone does. But your overall direction stabilizes. Over years, direction matters far more than occasional small mistakes. Personal finance isn't a perfection contest, it's a trajectory. Small advantages added up over decades become enormous. Small leaks compounded over decades also become enormous. And the daily decisions creating those trajectories are usually emotionally ordinary. Simple habits, quiet assumptions, automated savings, carefully considered purchases. The architecture of financial life is mostly invisible while it's being built, but eventually it becomes impossible to ignore. If there is one thing worth remembering from this entire conversation, it's this. Your life will move toward whatever you repeatedly evaluate as important, not what you casually wish for, not what sounds intelligent in conversation with your friends. What you emotionally prioritize in ordinary moments reshapes your future. Which means lasting financial change isn't primarily about becoming a different human being. It's about seeing things more clearly, seeing what your current evaluations are producing, seeing which beliefs increase your agency and which ones reduce it, seeing the future as something real enough to care about today. And once that clarity settles deeply enough, something changes. It shifts and morphs. Many of the behaviors that once required exhausting discipline begin to feel natural. Not because your life suddenly got easier, but because your internal compass finally points in the direction you actually want to go. Thank you.